So I would like to welcome David Brown as our next speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katie. One thing I'd like to acknowledge is my caregiver of some 37 years behind the camera here. That's my wife, Amy. So, between 2013 and 2018, I had 5 MRIs of my brain. When radiologists and neurologists look at an MRI and they're interested in neurodegenerative diseases, there are a couple things they are interested in. One is the volume of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain that translates short-term memories into long-term memories, so it's about learning. It also keeps you oriented in time and space, so you know what day of the week it is, you know what city you're in, those kind of questions, and a lot of you may be familiar with asking those kind of questions of people where you're trying to assess their situation. They also look at the ventricles, especially the lateral ventricles. The ventricles are void spaces in the brain, and as the brain atrophies, they grow. So in 2017, when they did the one particular MRI that set the pace for the next, they found that my hippocampus volume was at less than the 1 percentile for men my age, and I just turned 70. And the volume of my lateral ventricles was greater than the 99 percentile for men my age, which would mean that in a room of 100 men my age, I would have the smallest hippocampus, and I would have the largest lateral ventricles. And the ventricles there are, again, a proxy for how much atrophy has occurred in your brain. So that means my brain was shriveling up like a prune. Now, I think if we were to go do MRIs of some of your more serious people in your memory care, in your memory care facilities, you would find, what I see on the internet is they find those are the numbers they find for people in severe dementia. Now, my neurologist cautions me about that. She says that there's not a direct correlation between cognition and those numbers, but it's a pretty strong consistency. So by rights, I should not be here standing before you talking about this stuff. Now, this all began for me in 2012, excuse me. Okay. It started with me feeling kind of dizzy, having trouble with balance, having trouble walking a straight line. And so I went to a neurologist and I told him, you know, my grandfather had a tumor in his brain when he was my age, and that tumor was causing him to have these kind of symptoms. So I'm worried that I have a tumor just like he did. So we went and had an MRI, and there was no tumor. So he said the next step is we need to see what's going on with the vestibular system in your ear. So I went to an audiologist and they did some kind of testing with some really fancy equipment. They put some special glasses on me and they watched the irises of my eyes, and they made my head tilt back and forth and a bunch of stuff like that. And he concluded there's nothing wrong with your vestibular system. Now, if there's nothing wrong, if you're having trouble with balance and there's nothing wrong with your vestibular system, it kind of says there's something wrong with your brain. But even so, that didn't really add up to anything yet. 2014, into 2015, I start to have some questions about my own professional work. I was an engineer. I was also teaching high school science, but I was an engineer out here at the Hanford site. And part of my job was reviewing documentation associated with computer software. And I'd be on a team and we'd all be reviewing this stuff. And I noticed other people were finding issues that just blew right by me that I used to be able to find really easily. So I started having a lot of really big concerns about how I was performing in my profession. And then one day I went to Walmart and I needed some cash. I got some cash from my cash machine, went to buy something, and then started to walk out of the store, and there's this woman comes running after me, shouting for me. And I'd walked off and left my credit card and a stack of cash right there on the counter. And didn't know it. I just hadn't have enough presence of mind to see that. So that prompted me to go back to the neurologist and say, I'm having more issues. It's not just the balance, and maybe they're related, maybe they're not, who knows. And so the neurologist administered what you may already know about as the MMSE, the mini mental state or mini mental status exam. And part of that is 3 words. He drilled me on these 3 words: penny, apple, table. Over and over again. I thought it was silly. You know, it got to the point where it seemed silly to me. And then he had me go do the serial sevens, you know, 100, subtract 7 from that, subtract 7 from that. And then that really kind of blew me away, because I knew that I couldn't do those numbers, and I started guessing, and I guessed all wrong. So at the end, then as soon as we were done with that, then he says, okay, now what were those 3 words again? I could remember 1. And I racked my brain, and I thought it was so silly. He had drilled me on those words repeatedly. Why couldn't I just pull back those 3 simple words? And he told me what they were later. Got in the car, drove away, and said, now what were those words again? I couldn't remember any of them. And now, at the end of the discussion, he told me about mild cognitive impairment. He said it's something we call mild cognitive impairment. And he frankly didn't tell me much about what that was all about. What it turns out he wrote in his record was he wrote early stage senile dementia, likely of the Alzheimer's type. That's what he wrote. So I went home and I talked to some friends. I talked to a nurse friend of ours and said, I really need to go somewhere where they're more sophisticated in assessing these kind of things. One of the things I did, I started doing a lot of research on the internet. I Google MCI, mild cognitive impairment, what does all that mean? One of the first things I come up against is, it says people with mild cognitive impairment in 5 years have a 50% probability of being in outright dementia. And you can guess that kind of shook me up. And so I'm really interested in learning more and finding out more about what can be done about this stuff. I was aware that there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease. That was everywhere you look, that's what they tell you. But they were also talking about a cure, and they said that, and there was a lot of very confident people saying that by the year 2019, we will have an approved drug for Alzheimer's disease by 2019, all through the FDA, everything. Well, here we are in 2019, and there's no drug even on the horizon right now. So I got a referral from the neurologist here to Harborview, to the Brain Wellness Center there, and I got hooked up with some really fabulous people. And we got an appointment up there, and instead of the MMSE exam, I had a couple hours of neuropsychological testing. And then they did an MRI of my brain with their super duper 3 Tesla MRI machine over there. And they said, come back in 2 weeks and we'll talk to you about what this is about. So we came back, and now, just one more comment about the local neurologist that struck me about our last meeting was the very sad, sympathetic look that he gave me. And this is kind of like, sorry to tell you this horrible news, which I can understand him that way. We went to back in 2 weeks to receive the results of the testing, and I got the same sad looks. And they said, they particularly pointed to the MRI results that were really kind of scary. That my brain is just shriveling up. And they talked to me about MCI, mild cognitive impairment. We talked about Alzheimer's disease, and we talked about dementia. And we'll talk in a minute ago about the transition from MCI to dementia. But basically, they said, here's what you can do. Here's what we know you can do now. And they gave me a list of things that included about 20 minutes of aerobic exercise 5 times a week, maintaining social connectivity, working on getting a good night's sleep every night as best you can at your age, and continuing, I was trying to learn Spanish, keep that up, those kinds of things. So they talked about diet. The other thing is eat a Mediterranean diet. They gave us a piece of paper with all those things listed on it. Took those home, did not immediately believe that if I did any of that stuff it was going to make any difference. But then I started looking on the internet and I started reading a whole lot about new studies that talked especially about what aerobic exercise can do for brain disease. And the thing I was reading about in particular was this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a protein that's generated during aerobic exercise in particular, that's able to actually repair damaged brain cells and can prompt stem cells in the hippocampus to form new neurons. Okay, so this is something that I picked up on, and so I decided, well, maybe getting aerobic exercise is a good idea. So I started, I missed a really important part here. Right about this time, I realized that I was not safe driving a car. If I would change lanes, I'd look to see if there's a car in the lane I'm trying to get into, and there was a car there, I didn't see it, and I'd try to change lanes. I would try to turn left at an intersection where there's a crosswalk, and I would look for the pedestrian would be there, and I wouldn't see the pedestrian. And I'd end up slamming on the brakes just in time. That happened about 3 times in a row in the space of a couple weeks. By couple, I mean 2, no more than 2 weeks. And I just, there was a straw that broke the camel's back there, and I just stopped. I'm not going to drive anymore, period. It's just not safe. It's too dangerous. I'm going to hurt somebody really badly, kill somebody. As it turns out, my office was about a mile from home, so I could walk to work every day. So I would walk to work and walk home. And then I was getting a little bit of more aerobic exercise. That was about as serious as I was about aerobic exercise, was making that mile to work and a mile to home. And actually, after a few months, I really did feel like I was having some improvement in my cognition. But one afternoon, I'm trying to walk home, and we live up in North Richland, and this George Washington Way, you have to cross that road to get back and forth to my office. And there's a high school right there, and I'm walking home probably pretty close to when the high school kids get out of there and you're taking your life in your hands under the best of circumstances when you cross that road. But I remember one day, I came up to the intersection, I'm getting ready to cross the street, and I'm watching the traffic. And I'm trying to figure out, what are they doing? Who's stopping? Who's going to go? Who's going to turn? Who's going to go straight? How do I get safely across the street? I was just totally baffled by what I was looking at. Then I watch a car come up the road, up to the intersection, turn right, head down toward the river, and it suddenly occurred to me, the cars go on the right-hand side of the road. Once I realized that the cars go on the right-hand side of the road, everything made sense. And so I had no trouble saying, okay, here's what I got to do to get across the street safely, and it was all good. But this also, I don't mind telling you, really shook me up, because it was bad enough, the problems of changing lanes. I thought that the reason I was having trouble with driving was that I was forgetting to look. I later realized that I was looking and not seeing. And this is something we'll talk about a little more in a few minutes. Now, the people at Harborview, one of the things that they wanted Amy and me to do was to participate in a Mayo Clinic study called HABIT, where it took 2 weeks of time up in Seattle with a bunch of other people with the same kind of experience. And while we were there, we did a bunch of things. We did yoga, we did support groups, we did writing your personal history, your autobiography. We did and they had education was probably one of the most important things, where they taught us about the role of diet, they taught us about the role of physical exercise, and all the things that were understood then and are understood now to be the things that can be done about Alzheimer's disease in the absence of a meaningful pharmacological solution. When we got back from that, this was November 2015, when we got back from that, the first thing I did was go down, join the gym. There's a gym a mile from our house that I drive past every day. It's right next to Starbucks. I was going to Starbucks every day, right next door. So instead of going to Starbucks, straight to Starbucks, I'd go to the gym every morning. And started out with about 25, 30 minutes on the treadmill every day. And gradually working up to where I could elevate it up to 15 degrees, and I could get up, going up about 4 to 4.5 miles an hour, and doing that pretty well. And I started to feel better. Now, I didn't have any specific objective way of knowing that I was better. I did try to go back to driving and realized very quickly that it was not a good idea. So I stopped driving again. But I was feeling better, I was doing better, and then I went back for more cognitive testing. And what they showed was that there was actually objective improvement in my cognition over the previous year. And this, I don't mind telling you, is pretty encouraging. And I was also reading a lot of research. At first I was just reading whatever popped up on the internet when I Googled mild cognitive impairment. But then I started digging in a little deeper and actually going to the actual research studies and reading those things and learning more and more, learning how the brain works. Now, one of the things that you can do if you're on the treadmill every day, and I worked up my time, I'm up now and I'll show you where I came to these numbers, but 15 minutes a day, 6 days a week is the optimal, it turns out. And so when I start getting up to that, it turns out you got a lot of time to kill while you're standing there with a tablet in front of you, able to watch any YouTube video you want to watch. So I watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos a lot of them were classroom lectures by neurology professors and people like that, telling all kinds of interesting, fascinating things about how the brain works, and how neurodegenerative diseases work, how they attack the brain, what happens. So I learned a huge amount of stuff. And so let's go ahead and turn the slide here. So just I've been kind of going through this now. I just want to catch up with the slides here. First off, I want to just say that at this time, I was happily married for 33 years. It's a few more years later now, so we're up to 37. We have 3 grown sons working in Seattle. I retired in 2005 from the federal government after 34 years, but at the same time I got a teaching certificate to teach high school science. I was teaching physics and biology over at Pasco High School. But then I was also doing engineering consulting work, and I loved all that stuff. I really loved doing. I had a lot of fun doing photography and just everything I was doing. And now this, like I said, 2015 was when this all started, and here are the things I talked to you about already that ended me up at Harborview being assessed there. I stopped working in 2016. Now, one of the things that characterized my experience, I think is very important, and that is what I call the loss of joy. And there's something that happens, and I think it's physiological, that just robs you of your ability to enjoy things. It's just very, and also caused me to just sit on the sofa and stare out in space with no desire to engage other people. And so maybe some of you have seen this in your facilities. But that was what was overcoming me at the time. But I did read. What happened was, we went to Seattle, and I was investigating drug trials. I wanted to participate in drug trials, and so when we were in Seattle, we met a neurologist who was a principal investigator for a drug trial, who was actually from Spokane. He was there for some reason, I forget what. But we got to talking to him about this stuff, and I told him that I was experiencing improvement because of physical exercise. And he acknowledged that, but he said in his experience, he had 20 years experience as a neurologist. In his experience, the people that did the best were the people who maintained social connectivity. So this idea of social connectivity has a part to play, diet has a part to play, physical exercise has a big part to play. There are a whole bunch of things that go into effectively battling the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And let me say a couple things. I've already made it clear that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher. I'm telling you a bunch of stuff that I learned partly from personal experience, partly from doing a whole lot of research. And I believe that everything I tell you here will be accurate. But one of the things that we will talk about is these different, what they call domains of ways that Alzheimer's occurs and how it is confronted. So I was scared to death. I don't mind telling you that right now. And so, okay, so go ahead to the next one. All right, so today I'm driving safely. I drove here. I've driven to Seattle and back without any trouble. All those things that were associated with my problems with driving have, for now at least, have cleared up. I wrote a book. You can see a copy of it back there, and I got some cards there. Hopefully, I probably didn't bring enough cards, but you can take home with you to Q. You can buy the book on Amazon. I'm not able to sell them here, so but you can, if you're interested, you can get the book on Amazon. It's my personal story combined with what I've learned, with the idea of explaining here's what I experienced, and here's here's why. Here's what caused that. And I do stay active. I stay active like Katie was talking about, teaching the Bible class, not just at her facility, but also in our church. I work at the food bank every week. Every Monday I'm at the food bank working alongside other people. That's social. One of the things they told me in Harborview is don't quit your job. And the idea behind quitting your job, not quitting your job, is at work you stay connected with other human beings. But my work had me working from home. That wasn't doing any good for me. So I just said, I think it's time to cut the cord. So I cut the cord, and the food bank is a very good substitute for that mode of social connectivity. And I don't mind telling you, I've had a whole slug of cognitive tests. Partly, Harborview tests me every summer. But also I've been in a couple of drug trials where they test me again. And if I was up here in 2012 and I was down here at the end of 2015, each year my cognitive test scores have gone like that at Harborview. It is amazing. Every morning when I wake up, I just can't believe that I'm able to think, able to function, able to drive, able to do whatever. And they have told me that it's likely that if they were to compare someone with normal aging, that my test scores would reflect normal aging for someone my age. Okay. So, I don't want to confuse Alzheimer's disease and dementia. This is a question I get all the time. Is Alzheimer's disease dementia? Is dementia Alzheimer's disease? What's the difference? Now, I think very likely in this room, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know already. But dementia, of course, is an umbrella term that captures perhaps as many as 30 different causes. The same thing goes for MCI, mild cognitive impairment. It's an umbrella term that is a condition that's a syndrome that's less advanced than actual dementia. Okay, so about 60 to perhaps 80% of the cases of dementia in the United States today are caused by Alzheimer's disease. However, there's a complicating factor, and that is whenever they do an autopsy on a brain of someone who had dementia, they will very often find the plaques and tangles that we'll talk about in the brain that are the signal evidence of Alzheimer's disease. However, they will also find evidence of the other things that cause dementia. So there's a lot of confusion, and it's difficult to come up with numbers of who is suffering from dementia because of Alzheimer's disease. So it's a confusion factor there. Now, MCI itself is not a death sentence. It's it could be a vitamin deficiency. It could be a medication you're taking. And those things can clear up on their own, or you can, my father had dementia. Very likely in the autopsy they found he had hydrocephalus, which could have been treated, and that may have been the reason he had dementia, was the hydrocephalus. So there are reasons why you might have A, mild cognitive impairment, or B, dementia, because of things that can be dealt with and can be treated. And so many of them will resolve spontaneously. But if it is Alzheimer's disease, it's going to progress. It's going to progress. Now, at this time, there's no drug and there's no dietary supplement that has been shown to reverse, to stop, or even to slow the progress of Alzheimer's disease. It's going to happen. It's going to progress in a way that can't be modified by any of these kind of supplements or the medications. Now, Aricept, and I think there are another one or two drugs, will treat the symptoms, but it's a deadly disease. In Washington State, it's the third leading cause of death in Washington State. It's the sixth leading cause of death in the United States. It's a fatal disease, and if the cause of the MCI is Alzheimer's disease, the cause of the dementia is Alzheimer's disease, that will progress to death. Now, I was told in 2016 that I was on track to be dead by 75. I'm 70 right now, but I don't feel like some mornings I do. I don't feel like I'm going downhill that fast. And what the person who told me that was a neuropsychologist who specializes in a lot of the lifestyle modifications that can be done for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And he told me, you've bought 10 years. Okay, we don't have any medication, we don't have anything, but he drew a little graph and the graphs they draw, you look like this, you're like this, and boom, and that's where you're dead. Okay? He drew another graph out here, boom. He said 75, 85. You bought 10 years. I'm good with that. So that's where I'm headed. Now the other thing is, just one last thing about, I want to back up one. Okay, is this multi-domain approach. Now I initially concluded that the physical exercise was 100% of what was making me better. I'm not convinced of that anymore. And so these multi-domains we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so this talks about the book that I wrote. I did a lot of research for the book. I self-published the book. So far I've sold about almost 3,000 copies on Amazon. It does have some weaknesses. I would be delighted if you were to go home and buy one on Amazon. I'd be especially delighted if you read it. A, B, you liked it. C, you left me a nice little comment. If you're not going to read, if you're going to write a nasty comment, maybe somebody, I don't know. Anyway, what was I getting at? I put a lot of effort into getting the book. Oh, I know what it's saying. The book has some shortcomings. One is my scientific treatment at the end is a little bit unsophisticated. And it leaves you guessing at the end because I was participating in a drug trial for a special use of insulin. And you don't know how that drug trial turned out because I'm announcing all these wonderful advances and increasing test scores. What you don't know, what I found out after we published the book, I was on the placebo. So the insulin could not have been the cause of my improved cognition. It had to be entirely due to my lifestyle modifications. Diet, exercise, making sure I was actually doing better in the social connectivity now because I wasn't getting enough at work, and the food bank and other activities was actually jacking that up. Sleep is important, those kinds of things. Now, again, the amount of aerobic exercise we're talking about to actually produce the kind of results I've seen is fairly aggressive. 50 minutes, I based this on some research. I ended up at 50 minutes a day, 6 days a week. But the concept, how hard you have to go is after 10 minutes you should have trouble talking and you should start to be developing a sweat. Okay, and then to keep that up for 50 minutes. Now, I had to work up to that. Didn't happen overnight, but it was, let me tell you, in my position where I was at is life and death. And so I was willing to do it. What's discouraging to me is meeting people that I know would benefit from this and telling them and having them nod their heads and say, yeah, that's right, and then find out they're not willing, they don't have the will to go do it. In the office where I was working, there was another man who was having very similar experience as mine. And the boss went to him and said, you know, you need to go talk to Dave over there. And I never met this guy because our office was diffused. Like most people like me was working at home, so I didn't meet people in the office. But he said, this guy can help you. He knows how you can dig yourself out of this. And the guy didn't want to consider it. He'd already given up. And as far as he was concerned, he was still working. But as far as he was concerned, it was all over, and he wasn't willing to put in the effort to go do something to get himself out of it. So this is something I run into all the time. I get a lot of nods, but then it's pretty clear that they're not willing to put in what it takes to go give yourself 10 more years. You know, so I don't know. All right, here we go. Why is exercise important? First off, it does improve circulation of blood to the brain. That can't hurt. There's an incredible connection between the heart and the brain. The brain has a lot of blood flow. The brain is using more energy than any other part of the body. You'd think the muscles are all using all the energy. The brain is using the energy. That's where the glucose all goes to keep the fires going. Okay, so the brain, keeping the blood circulation and there's a very powerful connection between cardiovascular disease and dementias, including Alzheimer's, but also several others. But the other one is this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is something I'd never heard of before I started doing the research, but it's just magic almost, what it does. It's very powerful. And it is able to, like I said, it's able to repair damaged brain cells, and it's able to prompt stem cells to form new neurons. Okay, now here's an older study that I think is important, as a classic study in the study of aging, brain aging. And it was a study with about 6,000 women, studied over a period of 6 to 8 years, examining how many of them, well, not how many, what happened with their cognitive test scores, and relating that to how much exercise they got. And they judged the exercise based on how many blocks they walked, how much stair stepping they did, those kind of things. So they monitored these women for 6 to 8 years, and they divided up into 4 quartiles based on how much they walked. And you can see the first quartile. On the left-hand side, the percent is what percent experience cognitive decline. And there's a very clear relationship between the more exercise you got, the less decline. It's just hard to argue with those kinds of results. Now, the next question is, and this is a much more recent study, how much exercise is enough? And this points to one of the problems that we have in trying to do research and knowing that someone is suffering from Alzheimer's disease or what other kind of dementia might be at work, because you want to know what disease you're studying. So how do we find people who are with Alzheimer's disease, and we're confident there's not Lewy bodies or some other cause of cognitive decline that might be at work here? So younger onset or familial Alzheimer's disease, which occurs usually in people who are in their 50s, maybe in their 40s. Very early they start to develop the symptoms, It is driven entirely genetically. If you have the disease for it, you're going to get it. If you don't have the disease for it, you won't get it. It's very rare. In the whole world, there are probably 300 families with this gene. They're carrying this set of genes that are out there. But there are enough of them so that I run into people who know people or who have this genetic makeup, and they are getting it and then will die. So what's helpful there is at least we can identify people who maybe have developed no symptoms yet but will, and will be coming down with the disease. So we can study these people. Most of those people tend to be people who are kind of scared to death. They had it in their family already. They've seen it, the results, and they want to do something about it. And they're eager to participate in studies. They're eager to cooperate with researchers. And so what we have here is a study in which they took a group of people who were known to be developing Alzheimer's disease because of their genetic makeup. So they were easy to study, and they were willing to do a lot of exercise. Some of them were willing to do a lot, some weren't so willing to do a lot. So it was easy to divide them up. The people who don't want to, okay, you guys do this and you guys keep it up. And then he studied to find out, well, how much exercise, how much aerobic exercise produces how much improvement. Yeah. And so they were able to construct this curve here, and they were doing the MMSE exam, and they found that there was a peak. And after that peak, it started to go down for some reason. And basically that peak is 8.5 hours a week. So people who worked out more than 8.5 hours a week actually were actually hurting themselves in their brains. But there was really a lot of improvement that they could measure up to about 5.5 to 6 hours a week. So that turns out to be a pretty optimal point, target to shoot for, which is what I use. Now, we don't know that these are the same, you get the same results with every form of, every causative factor. There's a lot of things that participate in the disease. A lot of things that appear to be able to trigger it, other things that appear to aggravate it. So it's hard to, this is a narrow slice. It may be that other ways in which the disease forms might have different results. We don't know. But this is the best one that I could find gave me a target that has worked out very well for me. I do not have any of the standard genetic factors for Alzheimer's disease. I've had 23andMe is very happy to tell you what your genetic status is for Alzheimer's disease. They were forbidden by the federal government from doing that for a while, but they have to counsel you that if you have such and such a disease, this doesn't mean that you are going to get the disease. And we're talking about for the more common types of Alzheimer's, genetically prompted Alzheimer's disease. But you can find out if you have certain genes that could cause that. And I don't have anything. I don't have any genetic factors. I don't have any of the other factors that you would think would cause me to have developed this. Okay, now let me go through. There's what we call the multi-domain approach. So there's different domains. The first domain I want to talk about is diet. And right now, the standard thing to tell you is there are 3 diets out there that they promote for brain health. One is the Mediterranean diet, which is, most of you have heard of that before probably. There's also a diet called the DASH diet, which was developed to help with blood pressure, to help you control blood pressure. And then, since then, there is another diet that's kind of derived from those two. And the DASH diet is actually an expansion of the Mediterranean diet. But now there's this MIND diet, which is showing really tremendous promise. And it is it's very much like the Mediterranean diet. It's a modified DASH and Mediterranean. In fact, the M stands for Mediterranean, and the D stands for diet in the acronym there. And basically it's similar to the Mediterranean diet, emphasizes green leafy vegetables, keep your carbohydrates low. Carbohydrates do create problems for Alzheimer's disease. Olive oil should be your main source of oil. In the absence of butter, stick margarine, and many of the other oils and fats out there. So kind of focus on olive oil. Fish and poultry over red meat. So red meat is out. So I'm done with red meat. Okay, fish is okay, poultry is okay, and in fact, one serving of fish a week is really necessary to be part of this diet. More than a serving a week, there's no real advantage to that, but after one serving a week, there is clearly the evidence, there's powerful evidence that's helpful. Blueberries and strawberries have a specific chemical in them that is very helpful to brain health because it's an antioxidant. Tree nuts, walnuts, almonds, especially, those are all big. Whole grain bread, beans, keep the carbohydrates down, and those should be still included to a certain extent. No stick butter, margarine, no cheese, which was very disappointing, very disappointing. And there's moderate red wine. I don't drink, but there's also a chemical in red wine that's very beneficial and a good antioxidant. So now, there's recent research that shows that this MIND diet actually is better than the other two diets for brain health. And I like to say, my perception is, and my Dave Brown perception, is that with the Mediterranean, the DASH diet, it's keeping your disease from being worse than it would otherwise be. So this MIND diet may actually help with reversing the progress of the disease to some extent. There's a major study going on right now with Harvard Medical School and the Rush University in Chicago, which has several hundred people doing the MIND diet compared to with people who are not. And this is supposed to be we're hoping this is going to be the definitive study that will tell us exactly how beneficial this MIND diet is for brain health. The results aren't expected until April 2021, so we don't know yet. But there are some other studies that really have created a lot of hope around this diet. So here are the kinds of things that are in my diet. There are fish, avocados, broccoli, tomatoes, a lot of tree nuts, blueberries. I forget what that was. It told me. Okay, the reason diets. There are two factors in the brain that we need to pay attention to. One is inflammation. Okay, so there are anti-inflammatories that are in blueberries, for example, that help fight inflation. Now, inflammation. Now, inflammation is your body's response to something bad, something invasive, or some damage. The problem is that when it goes to protect you from these things, it also creates a lot of collateral damage. So that's why if you're injured in running or something like that, you put cold or hot on it to fight the inflammation. Because the inflammation, at first it's good. We don't know why inflammation is a factor in Alzheimer's disease, but one theory is that the amyloid proteins that are building up, they're not proteins, but the amyloids that are building up on the brain cells, this is part of the brain's response to try to fight the things that are there that we want out, but it gets out of hand and it turns out to be counterproductive. That's one concept. So problem foods for inflammation are refined sugar, flour, a whole lot of stuff that's in fast food. So if you like to go to fast food restaurants, that's not helping you. It's not helping your brain. Omega-3 fatty acids, that's in fish and olive oil, they fight inflammation. Now, one caution here is that the theory is that eating fish, well, we know that eating fish can be beneficial for brain health. So the first question is, well, okay, what's in the fish that we can get out of there and help with your brain? And so omega-3 fatty acids must be it. So if we just extract the fish oil and put it in the capsules and you eat these capsules, that's just as good as eating fish. Sounds good. That's a hypothesis. In the world of science, when you have a hypothesis, you have to go test it. So the best thing to do is let's take a whole bunch of people, give them fish oil supplements and see if that helps. Well, that's been done a lot of times and has never been found to help. So eat fish, forget the fish oil. And especially if you're a man, fish oil has been correlated with prostate cancer. Not fish, but the fish oil supplement. So I started taking and I threw it up. Oxidation is the other thing that goes on. There are two dynamics in the Alzheimer's brain. One is inflammation, the other is oxidation. And what's happened over your lifetime is your body has absorbed different metals from the environment. Those have found their way into cells. And then oxidation, like rust, for example, happens in the brain cells and appears to be a part of the Alzheimer's dynamic, because it's a very complicated process. So things that fight oxidation appear to help with that. That's the blueberries have antioxidants in them. Now here's, as I mentioned before, there is no dietary supplement that has been shown to reverse, to stop, or even slow the progress of Alzheimer's disease. There's been a whole lot of work gone in to try to prove it. There are people who, with not very good credentials and not very good research to make claims about this supplement or that supplement, but we just haven't found one that actually does anything. There's a claim that maybe if we tried a whole bunch of different ones all at the same time, that would help. There is some research going on with that. I'm personally kind of skeptical that's going to take us anywhere. However, if the dementia is being caused by, for example, vitamin B12 deficiency, then vitamin B12 supplements would definitely has been shown to actually reverse those kinds of dementias. Okay. Sleep is another big factor, a very big factor. Sleep can contribute to poor sleep can contribute to the onset of Alzheimer's disease. It can aggravate it. I have sleep apnea. I use a CPAP machine, so that is something that I think has been very helpful for me. It's the older you get, the harder it is to get a good night's sleep. I know that for a fact. Okay. Now, one of the problems with that is the poorer your sleep, the more you're going to aggravate or increase your risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease itself impairs sleep. So you get this vicious cycle where you sleep poorly, it aggravates Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease makes you sleep more poorly, and it just gets worse and worse. So you do everything you can to make sure you're getting the best sleep that you can. Social connectivity, I talked about that a minute ago. That is, I think, far more important than I first really accepted. It really is important to keep talking to people outside of your family. You need to keep some kind of things going on with other people. Reduce stress. Stress was a factor. One of the problems with stress is the stress hormones attack the hippocampus. So reducing stress, not eliminating it, but reducing stress was, for me, a part of reducing the effect of the disease. Learning. It turns out that people who learn stuff, especially when you're younger, have there's apparently a protective effect on the neurons of the things you do when you learn, help the brain build resistance to Alzheimer's disease. Now, one of the things I did was learn Spanish. One day when I was 59 years old, the birthday fairy over here brought me a set of Rosetta Stone Spanish discs, and so I got those and I started practicing with them, and one thing led to another. One thing I did was I read the Bible all the way through in Spanish to help me learn it, and then they needed somebody to teach biology in Spanish over at Pasco High School. So one day when I took leave of my senses, I volunteered to do that. So I taught biology in Spanish to 10th graders for 8 weeks while the teacher was out on maternity leave, and it worked out really well. There's a story behind that, but it's just, but learning a foreign language, I was skeptical, and if you read my book, I was still skeptical. I'm sure that it helps, but the evidence appears to be that it's most helpful when you're younger to build a resistance, what they call cognitive reserve.
Younger being before.
What's that?
Younger being.
Younger meaning, younger meaning in your 20s.
Oh.
Okay. There is one famous study called the Nun Study. You may have heard of it, where they take an order of Catholic nuns living in the Midwest who have all volunteered to participate in this study over many decades. I think this has been going on since the 80s, and where these women, they study their lifestyle, and then after they die, then they do an autopsy on the brain, and then they look to see what they find and try to relate what they find in the autopsy with how they behaved in the cognitive tests. And they're generally, there's a pretty strong correlation. If you find all these plaques and tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, generally that means that they should have had poor cognition, and often they do, but not always. So what they started to do is look at, okay, what characterized these women where we did not see all of this cognitive decline? They started looking at essays they wrote in their 20s. Where were they in their 20s as far as their cognition, their achievement, their academic achievement, and so forth? And there was a pretty strong correlation between women who wrote well in their 20s, had more sophisticated language, used bigger words, wrote more complex thoughts, were much less likely, even when they had some of this, the evidence of Alzheimer's disease or other disease, they still did better. Now, that doesn't mean it worked for everybody. I don't know how much they did to compare the other factors as far as exercise, who was getting the most, I don't know that. But the correlation with education and with educational achievement when you're younger seems to be pretty strong. So question, am I cured? Unfortunately, no. Looks to me like I've added 5 to 10 years, good years, let me just put it that way, because I'm in a lot better shape than I was here in 2016 when I hit the bottom of that. And it's just been going like that. So, if you want to know more and more stuff about Alzheimer's disease, my #1 resource is the Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures report. Comes out every March. Every March, first week in March, I'm checking to see if they uploaded it yet, because every year there's all kinds, for me, exciting news, and there news on what's going on in the research. What do we know new about the disease that we didn't know a year ago? It's just a fascinating resource for me. It's good for nerds. This year, one of the innovations this year was they gave a really great explanation for what we understand about how the disease evolves. How does it start and how does it evolve? It also talks about screening for the disease. The hope is that everyone from 65 years of age or older will be screened to find out if we can identify. Now, all these people that are 65 years and older have heard there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease. And so when you say, you should be screened, and they say, I don't want to know. If I find out something terrible, there's nothing you can do about it, so why should I be screened? So we still encourage people to be screened, but we do have a lot of resistance to actually going and doing that. So here's some interesting data that you can, talks about the 6th leading cause of death. These are the Facts and Figures report has all this interesting stuff. What's scary in there is the outlook for a tsunami wave of Alzheimer's cases as the baby boomer age. People like me, baby boomers, as we start hitting this age of 65 and older, and the number of us that are going to show Alzheimer's disease is increasing. Now, what's interesting here is the rate of Alzheimer's disease occurrence has actually been in decline lately. the rate, I mean by the per person, per capita rate has gone down. People are less likely to develop it now, probably because of all the focus that there has been in recently, the last 20 years, on controlling blood pressure, controlling smoking. All of those things appear to have played a part in driving Alzheimer's rates down. But that looks to me like it's going to turn. If you look at one of the big risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is diabetes. And I look around me and my peers, people my age, and it's a bad story. Too many people I know weigh too much. Too many people I know are developing type 2 diabetes because of that. And they are placing themselves at serious risk of developing the disease. And there are a lot of people are really worried about this tsunami, this what we call the silver tsunami. Of all these baby boomers, gray-haired baby boomers suddenly coming down with Alzheimer's disease, and likely because, in part because of the lifestyle decisions that we make along the way. A question I get asked a lot is the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's disease and how you tell the difference. Once you get to be over 60, for example, people are always talking about their senior moment. And the senior moment means, I can't remember your name. I know you and I used to work together for years, and I can't remember your name. Or I can't remember a word. There's a word that I use all the time, and I just can't think of it right now. Okay, that is a consequence, likely, of normal aging. Okay, because what happens is you can't remember the guy's name, or you can't remember the word. A few minutes later, it comes back to you. I remember now. Okay, that's normal aging. Now, when that word is actually gone out of your memory and is not there anymore, hidden someplace, that's disease. And when you can't remember those. When you have trouble learning something new, you're getting lost, those are not normal. It's evidence of disease. Okay. So how are things looking in the research world? I missed Joel's talk this morning. I'd intended to go to that. And he talked about what's going on in the world of research on Alzheimer's disease. The picture right now is kind of discouraging. There are things there's lots going on, but there have been some major failures of drug trials they had high hopes. I said a little while ago that they were saying by 2019 we were going to have a silver bullet, we'll call a silver bullet, drug treatment for curing Alzheimer's disease. And it's not here. The trials that where the hopes had been put on have come to naught. And it's been a big soul-searching exercise in the research community because it challenges some of the basic theories that we thought that we had for understanding the disease, how the disease starts, how it progresses. And it has to do with these amyloid plaques that build up on the brain cells that you may have heard of before. And those plaques may not be central to the disease process. They're obviously part of it. They may not be central. And so this has caused a lot of consternation. The first thing that we think is maybe we just need to start sooner because the disease starts a good 20 years before dementia. 20 years. It's been going on all that time and building up and building up and building up. And it could be that the problem with the approach, the drug design that we've been applying so far we're waiting till the symptoms have already begun to appear, and maybe that's just too late. So that's one train of thought. But the other train of thought is that maybe there is no silver bullet cure out there. That instead there may be a cocktail, shall we say, of different treatments that will work together to do something combined with the lifestyle changes that we need to make. All right, so the question, we got MCI, we got Alzheimer's disease, we got dementia, And how do we put all those words together? Because people ask me all the time about how to put those together. Again, they said the disease may begin 20 years before the symptoms. The first symptoms, when the person gets to the point where you know something's wrong, but you can still function relatively normally. You can live independently. It's not right, but you can live independently. You can still hold down your job. You can still drive. This is where we have mild cognitive impairment. And nominally, in Alzheimer's disease, that might last about 5 years. Every case is different, okay, but 5 years is a kind of a nominal amount of time when that might last. And again, there could be other causes of MCI, and usually at this stage it's not real clear what's causing the MCI. Okay, so how does the disease progress? And first off, you have the accumulation of these beta amyloid peptides. They are basically broken proteins that accumulate outside the cells, and these tau proteins start to accumulate inside the cells. Both kill the cells. When the cell dies, it bursts, and these tau proteins start to get spread around inside the brain. Then you hit a level of amyloid hits a level, the tau proteins are starting to get propagated, and the process in the brain of trying to get all this garbage out of the brain is involved with inflammation. So while the brain is working to clean itself up, it's also creating its own problems. Okay, so we have cell loss due to brain. Cell loss causes loss of brain mass. And the ability of the brain to metabolize glucose is impaired. Anyway, utilization of glucose in the brain. Again, the brain is the single biggest user of glucose in the body. And so it has to be, the way the brain metabolizes the glucose and takes it up into the cells and uses it in the cells is impaired. And that ability to function is dependent on the glucose, and when this is impaired, then the brain function is impaired, if I explain that clearly. Okay, so here's a little graphic that I made. The first is where the preclinical Alzheimer's disease is the first box. And then that progresses to MCI, which is the middle box, and the last box is dementia. The transition from MCI to dementia is made when the person is no longer able to care for themselves. Okay, so when I was unable to get safely across the street, you could make the case that I had made the transition from MCI to dementia. However, I'm glad to say I've come back from there. Okay, so, but that is, and then you can further divide that dementia into 3 parts. The third part is when the person is entirely bedridden. The middle part would be when the person is barely, can't remember their own name, for example, things like that. The first part is they're on the downhill slide, but they're still with us and they're still able to communicate. Okay, so I'm in MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. Like I said, I think that I did transition for a period of time into actual dementia. But everyone's situation is different. Okay, there are 4 syndromes of the way that the disease can begin. The first one is the most common one. It's called the memory syndrome. It's the one we're likely most to be familiar with. It's the one that when you try to remember a list of words or a story or something like that, when they test you, they're looking for the memory syndrome, and that usually indicates attack on the hippocampus. But that may not be the first part that's actually attacked. The second one is the visual syndrome, or the posterior variant, and the part of the brain that's being attacked here first is actually in the back of the brain, where the brain takes all the signals from the eye, and all that is information. There's no image there. It's got to take that information and turn it into, in your brain, in your thought, an image of what the eye is looking at. Because the eye doesn't make the image that's in your brain. It passes information to your brain. That part of the brain that takes the information and turns it into an image is actually being attacked. So in one of the early symptoms you might see, you might look at two things next to each other that are kind of identical, but one's bigger than the other, and you can't tell which is bigger than the other one. They both look the same size. Or in my case, you look to change lanes in the car, and you look to see if there's another car there, and you don't see another car, even though it's there. Those are symptoms of this visual impairment syndrome. The next one is a language syndrome. There's significant problems with word finding or understanding what's heard. If there's any static in the room talking, the person will be unable to discern the words of the person that's speaking directly to them. Now, the person may not be entirely cognizant of what they're saying. And I've seen some examples of people talking, thinking they're speaking intelligently. They're using words that maybe start with the same letter than the word they're trying to use, but they end up with gibberish. Okay. This probably related to word salad. You've probably all encountered word salad before. And then the last one's frontal executive syndrome or frontal variant. Now this is to be distinguished with something called frontal temporal dementia. It's not the same thing, but it's affecting the same part of the brain. And that is the prefrontal cortex where you do most of your thinking. This is something that's peculiar to apes, but hominids. Okay. Anyway, that's where your executive function, most of your executive function occurs. And the executive function is what helps you with planning. It what helps you with your social skills, your social behavior. And so people with dementia that have aberrant social behavior are displaying damage to the prefrontal cortex, damage to their executive function. Okay, so usually this comes later in the disease, but it may in some cases come very early. Any one of these, well, all of these will be manifested at some point in the game, but the ones that more often you'll see the memory syndrome first, but these other ones might show up first. Okay, now risk factors. What are the risk factors and aggravating factors for Alzheimer's disease? Age, obviously. 32% of people over 85 almost certainly have Alzheimer's disease. Women are at greater risk. I learned something new this morning in the other lecture with Joel from the Alzheimer's Association. That is that even though women will more commonly have the disease, they display the symptoms less distinctly, so that men fall faster, is I guess what I would say. Now, there's another gene, the APOE4 gene. Okay, this gene has to do with a protein that's involved in cholesterol and transport of cholesterol in the bloodstream, that sort of thing. But it has several variants, and one of the variants is there's the APOE2, APO3, and APO4. The APOE4 gene produces a flavor of that protein that appears to cause inflammation, and may be a spark for Alzheimer's disease. So you find this gene more often in people with Alzheimer's disease than not. So it's a risk factor. Again, you can find out if you got the gene by going to 23andMe, but again, it's a risk factor. It's not a determinant. If you find out you got the gene, that doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. It means you're more likely to, but you might be like me, no risk factors at all, and still you're dealing with it. So cardiovascular, family history. Now, family history doesn't need to be genetic. Okay, if you have a family history where everybody doesn't eat well, that could be the real factor that's causing the appearance of a genetic when it's wrong, not genetic. If everybody in the family smokes cigarettes, that could be right there. So you'll see the simple fact of a family correlation may be there, but it may not be genetic. Blood pressure, high blood pressure. The neurologists will all tell you what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So anything you do to help your heart is going to help your brain. That's that's a kind of standard dogma. Smoking, diabetes, obesity, poor diet, lack of exercise are all things that are present in many people who develop the disease. It's present in many people who advance quickly in the disease. Education, we talked about that a few minutes ago. If you have educational attainment, your chances of developing Alzheimer's disease are apparently reduced. Social isolation, I think that's a biggie, because people who are isolated are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. In my experience, it's like another one of these feedback loops, one of these situations where the worse the disease is, the less you want to be socially engaged. I did not feel motivated to talk to people. I did not want to engage people. I had to force myself even to talk to my own family. So, and that feeds on itself, because the more isolated you are, the less you want to engage. The less you engage, the more isolated you'll be. So, another biggie is head injury. Okay, people with head injuries, even when they're young, are more likely to develop Alzheimer's later in life. Some of the research I've seen suggests that the later in life the injury occurs, the more likely it is to develop into Alzheimer's disease. And one thing I'm thinking of is one of my neighbors who hit her head, fell down in the bathroom, hit her head, and then she developed dementia later on. My grandfather had that brain tumor I told you about. I would not be surprised if the surgery they did to go in there and get that tumor out might have contributed to his dementia, because that is just as much a brain injury as somebody hitting you on the head with a hammer. Okay, some recent surprises. One of the things that happened to me right about the time that I first started having these balance issues is I found out I had glaucoma. And it turns out more recently that there's been some studies that shows there's a strong correlation with people who develop glaucoma in their 60s or so also have developed Alzheimer's disease within months of the two diagnoses. That's very common. Okay, so, well, what do you know? They told me I had glaucoma, and then a couple months later I started having these symptoms. So I seem to be fit that particular pattern. What causes that, I don't know. Now, if I'm speaking to an audience of older men, a lot of them will be taking this drug tamsulosin for their prostates. And there's been a statistical correlation between people who take tamsulosin, like I took tamsulosin, with developing dementia, not necessarily Alzheimer's. So this is very, very recent, and it's not well developed. So then, as I mentioned before, I wrote the book. I got a few cards back there. I probably didn't bring enough, but where you can take home. And there's the book, and I think she's gonna auction that off or make it a door prize or something like that. So I have to have Amazon do all my sales, so I couldn't come here and sell them and sign all the copies or anything like that. But I would appreciate your taking a look at it at least. This says I sold 1,500 copies. That's old news. We're closer to 3,000 copies now. So.
Yay,
So here's my contact info. Now, I try to keep what I like to think is an interesting blog that does a couple things. One, it tells personal stories. I spend a lot of time in facilities like yours, just because I know people in there, know people that have been friends of mine for decades, and now they have dementia or they're somewhere. So I visit those people and try to remind them, read the Bible to them, pray with them, all those kind of things. So I do a lot of that. So I write a little bit about that, but I also very scientifically oriented. I taught physics, I taught biology, and I'm always interested in what's going on in research. And so I try to write about new things that I've learned about new events, new discoveries in the world of research, and how the horizon looks for some something significantly more effective than what we have today for actually dealing with this disease. Any questions?
David, is avocado oil beneficial like olive oil?
Yes, yeah. Avocados are really good stuff. I didn't mean to limit it to olive oil, but there are a number of oils that, like safflower oil, and some of the other ones that you might buy that actually can be detrimental. Yes.
You pointed to learning a language as being, but is there support also for learning other complex things or other classes?
Yes. Be honest with you, I don't know how much learning a language at my age helped with Alzheimer's disease. And the reason I say that is I began this before I started seeing symptoms. And I learned all the way through. As the disease developed, I stopped being able to add to my vocabulary. Okay, so, and then as I got into the exercise and doing all the other things that I did, then I began to add to my vocabulary again. Okay.
Well, there is some support, I know, for like square dancing, because it's aerobic, but also you're learning complex patterns.
I think that's true. I think that's true. There are a lot of different people with different opinions about these things. I watch the research as carefully as I can. There is good research that working in your garden, seriously, that they can measure increases in hippocampus volume in people who work in their gardens. Now they're not able to correlate that. They're not able to correlate that yet with improved cognition. Okay, but it's a start. You know, so work in your garden is helpful. There's a lot of these things that certainly can't hurt and certainly can help. Yes.
So you were saying that there's plenty of research having to do with risk factors and lifestyle changes for positivity, but I've actually never heard of someone making such a drastic, like a reversal almost. And so I'm just wondering, are you an outlier? Is this common where you change your diet and your exercise and then suddenly there's
Am I an outlier? And I can introduce you to a lot of people that will tell you that I'm an outlier on a whole bunch of different topics. So I don't think so. What brought me here was research on what happened with other people when they worked with other people. The biggest problem I see is people unwilling to do the things they need to do.
So do you have like testimony of other people that you know?
I'm collecting those. I have one. I'm putting testimonies in my new edition of my book. So I'm collecting those. I have one in particular from a woman in Everett, I think she is where she lives, that she's given me about her. She's been at it longer than I have, and she's living independently. She can drive. She's not. She knows she's still on the downhill slide. Okay, but she's had fabulous results from lifestyle changes. So I'm looking for other. I've heard of them. And I'm trying to find more. Yes, you got. My time's up.
Well, last question.
Okay.
So, kind of a statement also though, because you touched on like inflammation and foods that cause inflammation. I know that there's a recent study that's currently happening. I think a doctor over in Walla Walla that's doing a trial with the diet, a lot of it the low carb, but they have everybody go through both the genetic testing and then also a allergy testing, and using that information, creating a special diet for every single individual person, very individualized, because certain foods might be causing greater inflammation and making the disease process more rapid. So eliminating that from their diet, and so I thought that was kind of interesting. I actually had a potential resident who was part of that trial that explained that to me. I thought it was very fascinating.
Yeah. And what this points to is to this study I mentioned about the mind diet that is hopefully will be the definitive study on exactly that kind of stuff with the nice sized cohort and the more carefully regulated assessment of the results. What this also points to is there's a whole lot of stuff we just don't know. There are questions about gum disease. Is gum disease a factor? And there very well might be. There are all kinds of other things that go into herpes virus. Is that a factor? That very well might be. So there are a lot of things that are still being investigated that very well might hold the key to finding that silver bullet, or being able at least to make a contribution to the cocktail that will actually do something very helpful to someone who has the disease. So, yes, one last question.
What is your opinion on we learned earlier about virtual reality for dementia?
I didn't see it. And
Well, virtual reality is where you put on the.
well, I know what that is, but
Okay.
I didn't see how they might
Well,
tie together.
What do you think personally?
I haven't
I
thought.
mean, I can see where like skilled nursing or someone that hasn't been diagnosed with dementia or has Alzheimer's. What would you think about?
Is the idea to teach them what it's like?
Or just give them an adventure that they can't do right now.
Are you talking about somebody who's like people like you, or are you talking about somebody who's suffering from Alzheimer's?
Someone who is suffering from, because
Okay.
I work at a memory care facility.
Yeah.
So would I consider introducing virtual reality into my
All
facility?
right. I'm not in a position to answer that question. I really am not. I'm not.
What do you think personally though?
I'd want to see what happened. I'd be interested in seeing what happens. Yeah. See, I'm not.
I don't know if they would freak out or, yeah, I don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.